Christian program that may contain graphic descriptions of death, burial, and resurrection, and may not be suitable for those who deny the God who created them. Repentance and faith is advised. You're listening to the Bible Thumping Wingnut Podcast, the podcast that's safe for the whole family.
Unless your family contains professing atheists.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Bible Thumping Wingnut Podcast. This originates on Sunday nights now, and it's been a while since I did this, so I hope that all is going well. What I hear in my ears is different than what I normally hear. Okay, I'm fine. We're all good. It is June 7th, and this broadcast is originating on a Sunday night. And check us out every Sunday night. If you're listening on the podcast, we do this live. There's a video of this, and you can actually see me right now arranging my background because I realize I got some unsightful things in my background on my video. But you can watch this video right now in the description of this podcast. This is episode number 387 of the Bible Thumping Wingnut Podcast. Thank you for joining us. We have a panel of men who are going to be discussing our understanding of what it means to submit to the government according to the scriptures, according to what Paul wrote, according to what Peter wrote, and others. What does it mean to submit to the government? And how we're going to talk about specific examples of how we would look at different scenarios. We're going to look at different views. Not everybody on this panel agrees, and there's a spectrum on how we should view the scriptures in regards to this issue. So we're going to talk about that, and I don't think anybody on the panel agrees 100%. So it should be very, very interesting. Let me remind you that the Builders Summit registration is open right now. Early registration. Got an email, got a private message on Facebook asking, hey, give me some more information about the Builders Summit. The Builders Summit is a 3-day, 2-night event for men. We would call it a retreat, but men do not retreat, so we call it a summit. Men advance, they don't retreat. The Builders Summit is, you can find the registration at buildersummit.org. There are multiple speakers. Lodging is included. The conference is included, and all the activities are included, and all the meals are included, which is 6 meals and 2 snacks, more than enough food for everybody, all for just $169. $169. This is in the Northeast. It's in the Pocono Mountains. There's an airport you can fly into called Avoca Airport. We have people registering from as far away as Texas already in early bird mode, okay? And early bird ends at the end of this month. So you want to go to buildersummit.org and register today. Any questions, just email me. Or if you want to talk to some of the main guys who brought their churches, their men's groups in the past year, just let me know. I'll connect you with others who have been there. Everyone who attended last year said they would recommend it to all their friends and said they plan on attending this year. So don't miss out. buildersummit.org. Also, if this podcast is part of a network, there are 2 other gentlemen with me tonight that have podcasts on the network. Go to BibleThumpingWingnut.com and check out the other podcasts that are available. And then if you've been blessed by this ministry, please consider supporting us. We really need your support at BibleThumpingWingnut.com. Click on Support Our Ministry. And there are 3 different ways you can help us out. You can give on Patreon, which I so much thank those of you who are giving on Patreon. Some of you have been giving for years. And we could use more people helping us out on Patreon. Some people give on PayPal. That is a wonderful blessing as well. And some of you mail checks to the P.O. box, and that's an option as well. So 3 different ways. Go to BibleThumpingWingIt.com. If you appreciate this ministry, please consider doing that. Thank you, and that is the introduction. Okay, let me introduce who is here on the panel, which causes me to have to change my screen here. J.D. Hall of the Polemics Report is here, as well as Jonathan Bradford, who's a friend of BTWN and the Polemics Report, and J.D. Hall. Jonathan Bradford from Canada is here, and John Williams from Servant's Heart Podcast, which is on the Bible Thumping Network. And then John's brother is here as well, Ed from Texas. Ed Williams is here as well. And you guys can tell us a little bit about yourselves when you begin to talk. Maybe tell us, where you're from and your connection with BTWN and how you can tell us more about yourselves when you weigh in. Not everybody will be as talkative as everybody in this broadcast. Some people on the panel are just here to listen and ask a few questions, which is fine. Others will be talking a whole lot more. So, how this started? Well, we've Christians everywhere have been talking about Romans 13 and how we should or should not submit to our government authorities when they seem to be asking a lot or telling us a lot of things in regards to the COVID-19 pandemic and other things going on. So a lot of people have been talking about it. A lot of people have been writing articles about it. And J.D. Hall, who's with us here tonight, he had a podcast. What was the name of your podcast, Jordan? It was... Okay, I have it. George Floyd should have submitted to Romans 13, ? So I listened to it, and from the, when I posted it, JD, did you listen to my short rant on the wingnut wall yesterday?
Nope.
Okay. That's fine. When I saw this was uploaded, when I uploaded it to the network, I got pretty upset, and I hadn't even listened to it, and but I thought I knew where you were going, and I told somebody I was upset that you did that podcast. They're like, you should listen to it. So then I of course listened to it, and it's really a short segment. It's only from like 7. It's only about 13 minutes long, where you weigh in about George Floyd should have submitted to Romans 13 ? And in that, I probably should not take the time to play it, but we could talk about what you said there. You made a parallel to Tim Challies' article. Now, I do not endorse Tim Challies' article. However, Jordan, I am happy that God has blessed me to be in this country with a government like the one we have. And I think you would agree to an extent that the government that we have been blessed to have. But then you looked at Tim Challies' article, and then which Tim Challies was addressing, I'm glad I have a government who protects me and tells me to stay home when I should stay home, and my government is awesome. Tim Challies is in Canada. Of course, we've got a panel member who's in Canada as well. But Tim Challies wrote that article, and you took big issue with it when it initially came out. But now, when the George Floyd incident happened, you took that and you applied it to the George Floyd thing that happened, and you called out all the Romans 13, what did you call them? Romans 13 zealots.
Quislings.
You called them out, and you said, where are they now? Where are they now? And I did not like you putting those two together, and I did not like you calling out Romans 13 people, because although I disagree with Tim Challies and I disagree with other people who rally Romans 13 as we ought to submit to our governing authorities, those with flesh and blood on them, I didn't like what you had said, so I took issue with it. So why don't you put forward basically what your argument was in that podcast that you did.
To be honest, I say so many things. I don't remember what I said in that podcast. I do remember Tim Challies' article, which I think is truly one of the most woeful, informed, and patently ignorant things I've ever seen in my life. The argument from Tim Challies was Romans 13 tells us to submit to government, and we should be submitting to government. And God says in Romans 13 that the government's job is to ensure justice and to punish the wicked. And then in the next breath, Tim Challies says, I think we all can agree that public health is within the realm of government's authority. And I thought, how do you get from point A to point B? The government's job is to punish the wicked and reward the good. And then I don't know if it's the Canadian influence or what, but then he says, I think we all can agree, just like it's a normal statement and logically follows. Therefore, it's within the government's purview to ensure public safety or public health. I'm like, you didn't get that from Romans 13. You got that from somewhere besides Romans 13. That's the only thing I remember about like what you're talking about. I wish I could remember what I said a few days ago, but I can't. Probably the gist of it is, I would imagine, tell me if I'm wrong, you might know more than I do about it. If we're to say submit to government, no matter what, if what Romans 13 means is submit to government regardless, then we should look at George Floyd and say, you should have submitted. You should have submitted to the government. And to all those who are protesting the government, say, for example, if they're staying out past curfew, because in at least 25 cities, if not 30, around the country, they've called in the National Guard and have implemented curfews. If you're breaking that curfew, what happened to Romans 13? Because just a week ago, you were telling us, 2 weeks ago, telling us to stay home. Ed Stetzer marched in a Black Lives Matter rally. He was the one lecturing us to stay home. The same thing goes for for Joel Osteen and Carl Lentz. They closed down because the government told them to, and then they're marching in opposition of the government. And so it tells me that it's the popularity gospel. It's convenient. It's a convenient reason for them to be cowards and to close their churches. And the inconsistency of that is what's driven me nuts in the last week and a half.
And all that made my head pop off. And here's why. Here's why. Because I don't agree with Ed Stetzer. I don't agree with Carl Lentz. I don't agree with Joel Osteen. But I believe George Floyd should have submitted to the government, and he would be alive today. As I said in my response to your podcast, George Floyd would be alive today if he submitted to the government and didn't take drugs and didn't try to pass off a fake $20 bill and did not, in any sense, due to his physical condition and his rebellious heart.
Okay, let's qualify that. Let's qualify that a little bit. I need a little bit of clarity from you when you say he should have submitted, because I need to know if you mean pragmatically he should have submitted or morally he should have submitted. All right. So in terms of pragmatism, I've heard several people in recent days, Black folks, say, we don't have white privilege, so we have to give our sons the talk, not the birds and the bees talk, but we have to explain to them that if they have an interaction with the police, they need to be polite. They need to follow orders. If they get pulled over, they need to put their hands on the steering wheel. They need to turn on their dome light. They need to take the keys out of their ignition. They need to say, yes, sir, no, sir, and follow orders, or they might get shot. And, it's frustrating because I got that talk from my dad when I turned 16 and started driving, and I've lived my life by that. I got pulled over last week by a cop that I know. And I know of him. I know his family. I turned my, took my keys out of the ignition. I put my hands on the steering wheel after turning on the dome light. He asked for my license and registration. I say, I'm going to reach for it over here, and I have a gun here, letting you know ahead of time. That's not just a Black thing. That's so pragmatically. And I gave my daughter's driving now. I gave her that same speech. Here's how you avoid getting shot by the police. All right. Pragmatically, should he have submitted? Well, in terms of who has overwhelming power, you're going to wind up dead. It might be smart to do that. Okay. Morally, should he have submitted? I don't know the facts of the case. It hasn't been demonstrated in court, I know about the fentanyl and the Methodist system. I heard his family's medical examiner say that, but that's not what he was in trouble for, so far as I know. There was a counterfeit bill. I don't know that he did that on purpose. I don't know the extent that he resisted arrest or detainment. But the question is, when you say he should have, do you mean pragmatically, so he would not have got killed, or do you mean morally? And if morally, how do you know the facts of the situation to say he should have?
Well, he'd be alive if
or
he
does
did.
it not matter?
He'd be alive if he did.
You mean so it's pragmatic?
Pragmatically, and I would say more morally as well. But let me back up a little bit. Another thing that I took issue with you in your rant on your podcast is this assumption that you made this assumption, and you said it again already today in this broadcast, that there are people who believe you should obey regardless. Is there anybody you know who actually holds that position, that no matter what the government says they should obey?
No, and I appreciate that clarifying question from you. I think that, and yeah, there are some probably, right? There are some, but in terms of Christians, I think most Christians would say we should agree unless they're telling us to do something that is contrary to the Word of God. So when I talk about this, just assume that there's an asterisk. I would readily admit that most, if not all, Christians who have a vague understanding of the Bible would say we should submit unless it's a clear violation of the Scripture. That gets kind of murky if we're talking about something like the Lord's Day. But granted, I think that most would say unless they're asking us to disobey Scripture.
All right, so we'll accept that caveat and throughout this discussion, then, like we did last night. You and I talked on the phone for an hour and a half about this. So we'll always have that and know that there are exceptions to the rule. So you and I disagree on what it means to submit to the governing authorities. Scripture makes it clear that they're placed there by God. And one of the main points of disagreement.
No, it doesn't.
Okay, explain to me what you disagree with.
You said they, presuming you're talking about human beings, were placed there by God. I understand that's a common sentiment. I disagree with it. The authorities that exist have been instituted by God. You're presuming that the authority has to be a person.
Yes, based on
authorities that exist in order to do what Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2 says, which is to punish the wicked and reward the good. That authority has been installed by God to punish the wicked and to reward the good.
I believe that
it's narrower than what you've said.
I believe that the governing authorities that Paul and Peter speak of are human beings with flesh and blood. And in the United States, those governing authorities are the ones who, based on our structure of government, they interpret the laws and the Constitution as they've been written.
Which is why I said I hope you failed civics class when you were a kid.
Okay. Expound on that.
I mean, it's like you're saying, I think that our authorities are flesh and blood, as though that's like up to your subjective opinion. It's not subjective. Every authority figure that we have in this country only has the authority given to them under law. Whether it's a cop trying to search your house without a warrant, or the President of the United States having to act within his constitutional parameters, all of that is premised upon the concept that everyone has to submit to law, and that no person is the law unto themselves.
All right, I want to give the guys that are here. I know, John.
Yeah, I have a question. What about? I'm trying to understand what you're saying, Jordan. But what you just said, you're taking that from like Constitution or like constitutional law background, what you just explained.
No, I'm saying the Bible says to submit to your governing authority. You have to figure out what that is. Do you have an emperor? Do you go around obeying Domitian and Nero?
Well, what about
You don't. You have an authority.
Yeah,
you have to figure out what that authority is.
Which I would say would be the government, like Tim, an actual person. Especially if I'm looking at Second Peter, where it talks about kings or governors. I don't know where.
Start back at 1 Peter 13, 1 Peter 2, verse 13. Do you have your Bible open? Can you read 1 Peter 2, 13?
Yeah.
Okay, start with the first phrase and then stop there.
Submit yourself for the Lord's sake to every human institution.
Okay, stop there. The submission is to the human institution. In Greek, it is katenis anthropinus. If you're reading an ESV, you'll see a little bitty two. I don't have my Bible in front of me, and I'm on my phone, so I can't look it up. But to my memory, there's a little bitty two. Do you see that?
No, I don't have that.
Okay, well, you may not have an ESV, but if you'll see a little number 2 in the marginal notes. You trace that down, and it'll give you 2 alternative understandings of what that means. Katenis anthropinus. It is any institution ordained for men, which is a caveat that is missed. It must be ordained, properly ordained, or human ordinance. Which several translations translate it that way.
Right.
Ordinance, which is another word for law. Submit yourselves to the law. And then there are the executors of the law, whether the emperor or the governor that the emperor has sent. So not just any governor. It must be a governor the emperor has sent. Not a warlord, not a dictator, not a despot, but the authorized authority under the ordinance is who you submit to, not random authorities. Do you understand? You understand the caveat and why that's important?
Well, I'm following what you're saying here. Yeah. I just don't see it that way, but I could dig into it a little
What's
further.
An ordinance? I don't understand why you don't see it that way. What's an ordinance? What is an ordinance?
Well, what's an authority? So you're determining what the authority is. Either it's a document or a human. You're saying it's not a human, it's a document.
Hold on a second. I'm saying the law of the land is what should be obeyed. The law of the land. The word is human ordinance. That's what 1 Peter 2 is saying. Submit to the law.
So what?
Right?
Right, but then what you're saying is those who enforce the law, there's no obedience to them. Okay,
so they are called executors of the law. They execute the law. They follow it. They follow it through. They follow it out. Especially in our system of government, they're executors of the law. We submit to them so far as they are acting within the authority granted to them by the ordinance, granted to them by the law. So if the governor tells me to do something that the law does not give him the right to do, like wear a mask, I say, nope, you're acting outside of your authority. I'm obeying the authority. And if you would submit to that the word of the governor, which is outside of his authority, then you're breaking 1 Peter 2 and Romans 13. You're acting lawlessly. And by my disobedience, not submitting to the emperor, acting outside the law, I'm actually the one who's acting lawfully. I'm the law keeper. You're the anarchist because you're doing whatever someone tells you to do, even if it's contrary to the law. I'm the law keeper. You're the lawbreaker. And unfortunately, people are using Romans 13 to be lawbreakers.
Jordan, 2 questions in reference to that. One, maybe let me get both of them out and you can address them. One, in context, when it goes on to say whether it to be the emperor as supreme, that's the ESV that you were quoting. It seems to be talking about the emperor being supreme. It doesn't seem to have any concept of the emperor being subject to some aspect of the law. would you not say that it seems contextually to be pointing to people as opposed to law, and placing the authority in the people who are making the laws as opposed to the laws themselves? And my second question is in reference to.
No, I wouldn't.
Okay. My second
I'll let you
question.
go on to the next question, and then I'll
Okay.
opine a little bit more. Okay.
My second question is: do you think that Peter, writing this some 2,000 years ago, as he was writing it, was actually envisioning the kind of system that would come about 2,000 years later, where a country like the US would have a document that they have set up as being supreme, instead of the people being the ones in charge making laws?
I appreciate your first question. I don't appreciate your second question, because you might as well just have called me retarded. Clearly, Peter was not envisioning a democratic republic. Nope, he wasn't. Absolutely not. Now, when I say that, some people would say, aha, he wasn't even thinking about that. Of course he wasn't thinking about that. To who he wrote had a context. That's to whom he wrote had a context. It was a part of the overall context, obviously. Only an idiot would say when Peter wrote that to Romans, he was thinking about 21st century America. So obviously I wouldn't think that. But there's a principle in hermeneutics called the general equity. The general principle that applies outside of the initial context and other contexts. That is what makes the scripture profitable for reproof and correction in all sorts of different environments. We don't have an emperor. We don't have governors sent by the emperor. That's not how we choose our governors. So you have to contextualize that. I'm saying you personally, you have to say, then how do we follow this today if we don't have an emperor like Nero or Domitian? How do we do that? Let me I think your answer seems to be, well, Emperor Nero was a person, so we need to submit to a person. That's not a dynamic equivalent. Other than the fact that President Trump is flesh and blood and Nero is flesh and blood, those comparisons stop there.
So let me jump
We're
in.
a nation that is governed, just a second. We're a nation that is governed by the people, for the people, of the people. We're not a nation in which people are the law unto themselves.
Okay, Jordan, just to be clear, if we did have an emperor, would you wear a mask?
A Christian should be obeying their proper legal ruling authority. So
is that a yes?
I've said, yeah, it's a yes. And I've said, like, for many years, every time I talk about Romans 13, and the first I found that I did a lengthy rebuttal to Dr. MacArthur was back in 2015, in which I said, if you're born in a monarchy, submit to your monarch. If you're born in wherever it is, submit to that form of government. I'm a free man. I'm born a free man in a free country. I don't have an emperor. I have a nation that is governed by the people, for the people. So when an an executor of law overthrows the law itself to give an unconstitutional decree or order, it is overthrowing my emperor, my authority, which is their authority, which is the law. They're breaking their oath. They're the ones who are violating Romans 13, not me.
So if you were in a government where an emperor ruled and the United States came to conquer you, you would fight against the United States?
If we can maintain the asterisk of, unless that government was delegitimizing itself by telling me in this hypothetical situation to break the law of God, you should be a good citizen of your country, or if you're a peasant, a good peasant, or if you're a slave, a good slave. Unless, again, back to that asterisk.
Yeah.
I'm a free man. I don't have an emperor.
Is there ever a point where you would say, like, let's say a foreign nation does invade the U.S. and you're going to, fight for your authority, which, is the Constitution that sets forth the laws that you're to follow. At what point, or is there any point where you would say, okay, now this is a different country with a different governing authority than the one I have, or would you always hold to, I was born a free man under this authority of the United States Constitution, and I will always fight any government that comes and tries to usurp the government that I have?
I think we lost him.
I think we did.
Oh, I had a question for him.
He might come back. I'll keep an eye on
His reception might be bad where he's at. I don't know.
Well, my question is, until he comes back, is, I'll toss this out there. I understand what he's saying, and his argument's really good. But doesn't that set up situational theology? Like in my country, I'm a free man. So, and I have ordinances. I don't have a ruler. So I follow the ordinances, not the ruler. But in another country, they have a ruler, but they don't have ordinances. So what do? If it's ordinances, then you know what I'm saying? If you have an emperor or you have a dictator, a dictator, let's say, he's the one that gives the ordinances out of his mouth. He speaks what's to be told. So how does that work? And that's what I'm trying to figure out. And I think, his argument's really good. But I'm trying to figure out how that sounds more to me like a situational ethics thing. It only applies here, doesn't apply there. And if we start doing that with theology, then I think there's a danger there. And I was hoping he can get back on, because
His phone overheated.
Yeah. But you know what I'm saying? There's a situational theology issue there. It applies one way in the United States. It applies a different way in Canada. It applies a different way in Venezuela, where they have a dictator.
Well, I wouldn't say there's necessarily, I think theology is applied situationally in a lot of different ways. The general principles are always going to be the same. We need to figure out what those general principles are, but the application is going to be different at times. So
Jordan's back. Where were we when Jordan dropped out?
Is he there?
Yeah, he's here.
Yeah, I'm here.
Where were we when he dropped out?
I don't know. Sorry about that. My phone, I'm comfortable. It's like 65 degrees in my truck, but the sun going through the windshield made my phone overheat.
He was Jordan was saying something about he's a free man, and that, and Jordan, your argument's really good for it. But then I had the question of, while you were trying to get back on, is there's a situational theology situation there where one place there's a dictator, but in our country, then we have a constitution. So if it's not to obey authority as the flesh and blood, but ordinances, they don't have ordinances where there's dictators, unless the dictator says this is how it's going to be. So what, you know what I'm saying?
Well, there are definitely ordinances or laws where there are dictators. It's just what makes a dictator is that he is the law in and of himself. So when he says he wants to do, whatever he decrees is the law, de facto style. And someone living under that type of situation would have a very close correlation to the context immediately that Peter was writing in. They would understand that with very little work of application to their own culture and time. They wouldn't have to. I mean, it's straight across, apples and apples. But then, if you're talking about someone who lives in a very different form of government, he needs to determine what or who, either one, is his ruling authority, because they don't have an emperor. And here's, I guess, my simplest point. no matter what, unless you live in a dictatorship and have an emperor, you have to look to the law wherever you live to determine who you should be submitting to. That's what MacArthur found out when Grace Community Church had to ping pong. We will have church, we won't have church, we will have church, we won't have church. Because for 2 months, they're saying, now, if you appeal to the law, you are elevating the Constitution up to the level of the Bible. You know, you're believing the Constitution, you're treating it like it were scripture. No, I'm not. I'm saying I have to submit to my authority. That's what the scripture says. But now I need to figure out what my authority is, because I don't have an emperor. So what's my authority? Who's my authority? How does that work? And if you just refuse to appeal to the law at all where you live, if you just don't want to apply it at all, then you're stuck ping-ponging, like Grace Community Church did, who you're going to submit to. Because we live in a world even where there are contradicting jurisdictions, or jurisdictions are giving contradicting advice, where the president says one thing, but your governor says the other thing, and the courts say another thing. Okay, what do you got to do? Well, ideally, you'd look at the law and find out whose jurisdiction is it. Unless you're Grace Community Church, and then it's kind of like the last one to speak.
Okay,
you know?
so
you spoke last. I'm gonna submit to you.
So okay, Jordan, let's say you've got the person who has the right jurisdiction, but they are, in your opinion, they're going against the Constitution. Do you submit to them then?
No.
Okay.
No.
So this is
because that's not the right jurisdiction.
No. Okay. So you've got the right person who's supposed to be looking at the Constitution. They're supposed to be making those rulings in that jurisdiction, but they're wicked people, and or they view the Constitution different than you. You're still not going to submit to them. And my position is
no, because of Jesus, because of Jesus' testimony, because of Jesus' words in Matthew, I would not submit to them, because I follow Christ.
So my point is that governing authorities are not perfect, and many are sinful and very wicked, and I'm going to choose to submit to their wickedness even when they are in their wrong jurisdiction.
Yeah, can I qualify what I said a little bit? Okay, so there may be times when I would submit to something that is unconstitutional out of just a pure cost-benefit analysis. It doesn't mean that I think I'm morally obligated to.
That's what we're doing. That's what we're doing.
Let me give you an
Northeast.
example. Can I give you an example of what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I've got an example too.
Okay, well, I really hate game and fish. All right, so I don't think the deer in Montana are the king's deer. I don't think I need permission to take a deer. I think it's oppressive, especially if you're hungry. And if you're hungry, you ought to be able to go down there and fish for your supper without having to pay $15 for a fishing license. But I get my hunting tags and I get my fishing license because it's not worth the punishment. It's not worth the potential risk, because they can confiscate all my guns, all my sporting equipment, and take away my right to hunt for like 10 or 20 years. So but in this, I've told my wife, in this meat shortage that we could potentially have in this country, if it came down to it, and it won't, because I live in Montana and there's plenty of cattle, I would not feel guilty in the slightest putting deer on my dinner table with or without a hunting tag, because I have a responsibility from God to provide for my family, and if I don't, I'm worse than an infidel. So there are times where I might submit to them. It doesn't mean that I'm more morally obligated to.
That's
here. Just a second. Can you maybe submit that there are some people that your position there is maybe not that far off from the position that Tim Challies was saying that you addressed in your podcast? Similar concept, just drawing the lines different.
I'd say it's very different, because Tim Challies' argument is the government's job from Romans 13 is to punish the wicked, and 1 Peter 2 also says praise the good. Therefore, this is his giant leap in logic. Basically, everything's the responsibility of the government, even public safety, public health, telling you to be quarantined, even if it's not a matter of punishing the wicked. That would be the big jump, because I'm going to say God gets to define what's wicked. The government doesn't get to define what's wicked. The government is a minister of God. The government serves God. So God's the one that gets to define what's right and wrong, not the government.
People are asking in the chat, what's going on with John MacArthur? What's going on with John MacArthur? So let me say what's going on with John MacArthur, and then maybe, Jordan, you can fill in the blanks that I leave. Pastor John MacArthur at Grace Community Church, they closed the church when the government said you need to close your church because of COVID-19. And then he came under some scrutiny by some folks, and John MacArthur's response is, hey, the church is, the government is doing this for our well-being. They're not abusing the church, not abusing people. They're doing it for health reasons. This isn't Christian persecution right now. And Jordan will have to fill in some blanks here, but I'm going to skip ahead and say, when the president said that the governor should allow churches to meet, Grace Community Church announced, hey, we're going to meet. The president says we can meet. But then when the government, local government in California overruled what the president said, then Grace Community Church said, oh, we're not going to meet after all because we're going to submit to the California government. Unfortunately, Fred Butler wasn't able to make it tonight. He was going to come and put forth the arguments that they hold to there, but he wasn't able to make it because of a family member's health condition. So, Jordan,
Yeah,
there's more to that.
Yeah. So after Trump said, I'll overrule governors. By the way, I said at the time, that's not how it works. He's not going to be able to do it. The courts won't allow it because I understand how law works, right? After he said that, though, in Grace Community Church's statement, they said, by the way, like, we're glad this has happened. Praise Trump. It's all good. They said, it's pretty clear. Now I'm paraphrasing. It's pretty clear. They are targeting churches. They are treating us unfairly. It is pretty draconian. You know, it's over the top. So we're glad to be able to meet. Now, as Tim said, the first time around, they said our submission to the government is because they're not targeting churches. They're not being draconian. It's not over the top. This is for our health. And if it was, we'd have a different response. So from the beginning, they said, we'll have a different response if they're persecuting churches, targeting churches. Then they thought they were going to meet, and they said, by the way, we do think they're targeting churches. Okay. And then after the Ninth Circuit ruled against Trump on behalf of Governor Newsom, they didn't do what they said they would do initially. They submitted to the government, even though they said they wouldn't. They let the cat out of the bag. They said that if the government was being punitive to churches, they would disobey, and they didn't. So it's a ping pong back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, because of an unwillingness to check a 5th grade civics book to figure out who we're supposed to be submitting to. So there are competing jurisdictions all the time. And jurisdiction, that's another word for authority. The word in Romans 13 that says governing authorities, that word is exousia, not ecclesia. That's the church. Exousia. That means authority. So for example, in Luke, Jesus was taken, I think it's chapter 23, verse 7, if memory serves, taken to Herod because he was under Herod's jurisdiction. So that is qualifying that governments are not just like powers unto themselves. Even in that day and time, government had jurisdictions. That's my argument. Submit to a government so long as it's in its jurisdiction. And that doesn't mean a geographical area on a map, because Jesus was also in Caesar's jurisdiction. It's referring to where the parameters set by the law saying you have authority here.
But that jurisdiction in your mind is your interpretation of the Constitution.
Well, I'm a citizen. So this goes back to understanding our form of government. I'm a citizen with a capital C. We're a government by the people, for the people, of the people. And so it is my responsibility to determine what the Constitution says and how it should be followed. You know, when a police officer takes an oath to uphold the law, it's his responsibility to know what the law is. He should know. he should be defending my rights. He needs to know what my rights are. It is not acceptable for a police officer to say, I was just following orders. You need to be familiar with the Constitution. Every police officer that serves in this country should be able to pass a test on the Bill of Rights, every single one, because they're law enforcement. If they don't know what the law is, they're going to be really crappy at enforcing it. Okay. They have to know what the law is. That's the basic argument here, is that just because you say you're an authority doesn't mean that you are. Because if the law is not the authority, then you're pressed to determine what is and why. So is it because the government is an authority an authority just because it says it is? Is an authority an authority because might makes right? Is that what we're operating under? Because they have more guns, because they have more power, therefore they have authority? Because the United Nations claims to have jurisdiction in the United States. Do they? Would you submit to the United Nations? If you take all of those nations together, they've got more guns than the United States. They have a broader geographical control than the United States. What reason would a Romans 13 brigade guy have to not submit to the United Nations? How could you not? Romans 13, you would have to appeal to the law and say, well, the law that I'm under doesn't recognize the authority or jurisdiction of the United Nations. And the United Nations doesn't recognize our national sovereignty, but I individually recognize our national sovereignty. I don't care what the United Nations says. This is the real world that we live in.
I don't have to appeal to the law. I just appeal to the governing authorities over me, who say we don't have to.
When
submit.
they tell you contradictory things, how do you determine which one you obey?
When they tell me we don't have to obey the union. Now, John Williams, I think, has something to say. I muted you because your background noise. But
yeah, I apologize. I'd normally be in my study, but we're packing because we're getting ready to move. The way I see it is the Constitution is set up to protect the people, the citizens of the United States, from tyrannical government. I was discussing this with someone today. I think I discussed this with Ed as well. We got politicians who are unbelievers, who are corrupt, and unbelievers. If my memory serves me correct, our Constitution, our country was founded based on biblical principles. We have government leaders that are in a position where they don't believe the Bible. They don't adhere to it. Why should we expect them to adhere to the Constitution, which there's a lot of biblical principles that you can find in there? Number one. Number two, police officers are out to enforce the law. The problem with that is they don't, every time they turn around, the law is changing on them. If the government says, like our governor just came out after much pressure and said, religious organizations are exempt and excluded from the whole coronavirus thing, but we recommend you wear a mask. Now, me, I won't wear a mask. That's just my personal thing. If I go to the store, which I choose not to go, I don't want to wear a mask. One, I don't see the purpose in it for I'm a health professional from way back. Number two, I don't want to mess up my beautiful beard. And I see signs posted in stores. So JD, I can see your point. CVS Pharmacy. It is required by law for you to wear a mask in order to enter our property. No, it is not. But when you're licensed by the health department, you're a slave to them. And if they let me go in there, that health department can pull their license and they can no longer do business. We've got things that are starting to get lifted, but I'm understanding from what I read in Peter, and that is, it says, even under the king, governing authority, nations, the nation, the governor, law enforcement, and I forget which the other is on that. So I'm trying to understand a little more. I listened to your podcast, the one on George Floyd, and I listened to that, and I'm just, so I basically was on here tonight to gain a better understanding, because Tim knows you better than the rest of us, I think. So my thing is as Christians, it's not the law of the land necessarily that we need to be rebellious against. God ordained those authorities. He set them in place. Is what I read, that he put the authorities in the place. So
for a specific reason, to work for him as a minister of him, to punish the wicked and reward the good.
Right. And I think it is, what is it, First Peter, where he says not to, let me see if I can pull it up, to keep foolish men from speaking against you. I think it's what it was. Here it is. The governor is sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and to praise those who do right. Verse 14. For such is the will of God, that doing right you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. Act as free men and do not use your freedom as a covering for evil, but use it as bondslaves of God. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the king. I take that honor the king as honor the president, the governor, whoever my ruling authority is. I don't, I'll stop there and let you go ahead and interject.
I think there's a principle of giving honor even to the executors of the law. But to break this down a little bit, the governing authority, whatever it is, exists to be a minister of God. So when people say we're not electing a pastor, we're electing a president, we can go, well, we know what you mean by that, but we are electing a minister. We are. That's why they're called prime ministers in other countries. There's a religious reason they're called a minister. They're a minister of God. God has declared right and wrong, and they're to enforce it. And it goes back to the Noahic covenant and the system of justice that God established with Noah. Man has a role in establishing justice, law and order on the earth. And the emperor works for God, and the emperor may send governors who work for him. There may be a chain of command by the time that gets to you. And the governor, just like the government or the authority works for God, the governor works for the emperor. So in a hypothetical scenario, you have, let's say, a local governor who is acting contrary to what the emperor says. You need to recognize the emperor as a higher authority. The governor is a authority in that he's executing the law, but he's not the law unto himself. So if you have a governor who is usurping the power of the emperor, and this works in a first century Palestinian context as well, then you would say, well, I'm going to obey the emperor. So we're submitting to those ordinances, however they come to us, assuming that's the ordinances. But none of this presumes that there's not a jurisdiction or a purpose for the serving of the authorities, the emperor, the governors sent by him.
I want to bring up the mask issue again, because I have an issue with masks. I don't like to wear a mask. But I really dislike wearing a mask. But I wear a mask everywhere I go. I only take it off if I go into an establishment where people aren't wearing masks. And I believe if I didn't wear a mask in a lot of situations, I would lose my Christian testimony, because for many they have the understanding that I'm being unsafe and irresponsible and putting other people's lives in danger if I don't wear a mask. They're convinced of this. So I wear a mask for my Christian testimony. I also wear a mask so that I can work, so I don't get fired from my job. And I also wear a mask so I can go buy food, because you make decisions. You can't do any of that.
You make decisions as to what is Christian based upon the opinions of stupid people.
Well, I want to live my life in accordance to what Paul wrote, live peaceably with all men. And I also want to live my life in a manner that's above reproach. And when the culture's understanding...
You're abusing that. You're abusing that.
I knew you were going to say
You're abusing that verse. That's not what above reproach means.
I don't
By
want
preaching
anyone...
the gospel, you won't be held above reproach. By speaking out against women pastors, you won't be above reproach if that's how you're defining. You have pagans think poorly.
I don't want the... I think I don't need to make it an issue, Jordan. I don't need to.
Okay.
I don't need to prove. Oh, you know what? The governor has no right to tell me. I understand. I agree with John Williams. The governor has no right. The governor didn't write a law. There's no law passed in Pennsylvania that says you have to wear a mask. But
hey, and before I forget it, one of the things that really frustrated me about that Grace Community Church memo is that after the Supreme Court ruled, it said, that's the law of the land. And it frustrates me, the palpable ignorance of the American legal system. And people said, well, there are lawyers who are Grace Community Church elders. They ought to all be disbarred. What the court says is not law. Laws are written by legislatures. They're passed by legislatures. They're not decrees of the governor. What the governor says is not the law. That's the emergency order. The emergency order is not law. Okay. And by the way, I would be a lot more willing to wear a mask because the government asked politely than I would if they told me to. Because here's a thought exercise. Tim, I want you to think in your mind of a nation that is hostile to Christianity and persecuting Christians. So tell me when you get that nation in your head.
Okay.
Don't tell me what that nation is, but on a scale from 1 to 10, 10 being very free and 1 being not free at all, in terms of economic freedom, just economic freedom, how does that nation rank?
Not good.
Okay. Let's think about civil liberties besides freedom of religion. On a scale from 1 to 10, how is their freedom of speech and the press?
0.
Okay. Do you see where I'm going with that?
I'm still wearing a mask in that country too.
Okay. Okay, so the reason why Christians should understand who our rightful ruling authority is in its proper jurisdiction, and the reason why every Christian should be freedom loving, is because all freedoms are tied intrinsically together. Even property, by the way, the right to own property is tied intrinsically to the right to worship. And I could opine on that for hours. And if you want to give me an opportunity, it'd have to be another time, but I can get into it a little bit. But even the right to property is the foundational principle of individual civil liberties. Okay? Economic freedom is a civil liberty matter. You don't find countries where they're just persecuting Christians, but they have a high degree of economic liberty, or they have a freedom of the press. They have rights and assurances against unlawful seizures and unlawful searches of property. You don't find that. So a nation that is mandating I wear a mask and cover my face is the same nation, the same government that thinks it's going to have the power to tell me I can't go to church on Sunday morning. Screw that. I'm not doing that. I'm a free man. Well, what does that have to do with Christianity? You should wear a mask so that, pagans think better of you, and, that you'll be living peacefully with the government and they won't hate you because you're wearing a mask. You're doing what they say. No. The moment we say to them, we will roll over as though we're slaves, they will treat us like slaves, and they will take away our religious liberty. I'm not a slave. Don't treat me like one.
You must have a problem with speed limits and seatbelts then too, right?
You're bringing that up on purpose.
No, I didn't. I didn't know.
Can I say something? Can I say something? I know you're going to roast me for this, Jordan, but I'm going to say it anyway. I totally agree that a Christian should absolutely be a freedom-loving person. I think that's unbelievably important. I also think, and I believe this, and I'm convinced of it even more strongly, is that a Christian is a person who is willing to set aside his own freedoms out of self-sacrificial love for others. And we can discuss as to what that means and how that gets played out and applied. But I would say that that's the example that Christ gave us. We look at Philippians chapter 2. He, being in the very form of God, was willing to not partake of his divine privileges in order to lower himself in self-sacrificial love to serve.
Are you the Canadian?
I am, yes.
Okay, all right. I'll hold that against you. I don't consider that what you just said to be astute or respectful in any way. I want to respect you, but I don't think that your argument is intellectually coherent. I hear it said a lot. No respect for it. Jesus submitted himself to God. That is different than submitting yourself to the government. We are to uphold the law of the land, and an individual who would surrender their rights in one matter will be surrendering their rights in all areas. The submission to God is something that we ought to do. But if you look at the life of the Apostle Paul, he repeatedly appealed to his rights of citizenship in the book of Acts. He appeals to his citizenship and says, I appeal to Caesar because of his citizenship. The notion that as a Christian, we just surrender our rights is foolish.
2 years to get there. He took 2 years to get there. For 2 years, he didn't appeal to Caesar, despite the fact that at every point in time during those 2 years, he had that right. He bent very, very
explicitly in Scripture. He appeals to Caesar. What is it, Acts 17 or Acts 15? But Luke is pointing out from the beginning that Paul is clarifying. I think the earliest we see it in Acts chapter 5, he appealed to his citizenship. Paul is appealing to this the whole time. This is one of the reasons why they're sending him around to the different potentates. What do you have? 4 trials in total. Paul appealed to his citizenship rights. He didn't say, well, I'm just going to surrender my citizenship rights. And by the way, is there not a story in the Old Testament about someone giving up their birthright? How'd that end? How did giving up the birthright end? My birthright is liberty. My grandfather spent 21 months in a Nazi POW camp. My birthright's liberty. I'm not giving it up.
And Paul says his birthright in the kingdom is to eat meat. But you know what? I will, for the good of another, set aside my personal right out of self-sacrificial love for someone else.
Yeah, and then by the time we see the scripture roll around in Galatians, he took a different step in his ministry in terms of the circumcision of Titus as compared to Timothy, and on the meat eating end of things. By the time they started pressing in on him harder, he was a meat eater right in front of them.
For an entirely different reason, but yes.
I'm not sure that it was entirely different. I think Paul discovered over time that he couldn't appease pagans.
I would say the issue of circumcising Timothy was an entirely different issue than the issue of circumcising Titus.
Nah, it wasn't. Time went by and he was done dealing with the Judaizers and trying to appease them.
Okay.
He was done with that.
Yeah. I would disagree, but we're going to go on a rabbit trail there.
Okay.
We don't mind rabbit trails here. Let's talk about Border Patrol. Jordan Hall. Let's talk about how this applies, okay? I submit to corrupt individuals who are exercising authority outside of their jurisdiction.
You're a slave.
Well, if I'm a slave, I'm a good one. I'll submit to my master as
Okay.
Paul tells
You
us
can-
we ought to.
You can be a good slave. I'm going to be a free man.
So
You're a slave. I'm not. I'm not by nature a slave.
So when you go to the border patrol, I just have to play this clip. This is Steven Anderson at the border patrol. Glorious. Steven Anderson. So somebody who was going to be on here, but couldn't make it, was like, hey, if the government gives me an unjust rule, like, hey, you can't stay out after 9 o'clock, I'm like, fine, whatever. I mean, I'm not out after 9 o'clock anyway. But Jordan Hall's the kind of guy where if you tell him he can't be out after 9 o'clock, he's going to be, even if he's never been out after 9 o'clock for 2 years, he's going to be out at 9 o'clock to be there. I
can't express the disgust that I feel in a person who says a little bit of tyranny is okay as long as it doesn't cramp my style. As long as I wouldn't want to be out after 9. I mean, what's a little bit of tyranny? I don't even want to fellowship with that person. It's disgusting. It's disgusting. Have any of you guys been to Arlington Cemetery? Any of you? Have you seen it?
I've seen it.
It had a powerful influence on me. When I was 17, I'm looking at all these graves. And then you go to those graves that don't even have names on them because they don't even know who's in them. And some idiot, snowflake from the 21st century is going to go, well, I don't see a problem with tyranny. I didn't want to be out after 9 anyway. What's wrong with you? Grow some balls. Like, be a man. Stand up for something once in your life. It may affect somebody else. Like, liberty must be free or it's not. If you have to ask permission to do something, it's not a liberty. It's a privilege. That's the difference between our Canadian friend and an American. We have the concept of an inalienable right. Inalienable rights are not written into Canadian law. They have privileges.
Some of them
we have rights. We have rights. What?
Some of them are. I still like the fact that our Canadian Charter of Human Rights, the preamble says, recognizing that all rights are something to do with come from God and the rule of law. Is actually in our Charter of Rights. So we do recognize some, not as much.
The freedom of speech is not one of those listed, right? There's not an inalienable right to free speech, correct, in Canada?
I don't believe it uses the word inalienable, but it does. I believe freedom of speech is in that Charter of Human Rights, which does start with preamble, still referencing God. I don't think it'll be there in a few years, but it still does recognize that.
And this is my frustration with the church closures, is because people were saying like, well, we shouldn't be having church anyway. I mean, it's even if it's not the government telling us we shouldn't, we should still socially distance. And okay, I get that, but that doesn't mean that you excuse the government telling you to close down. So the moment someone says,
Agreed.
you know, it is within the government's purview to tell the church what to do, is the moment you just took an inalienable right and turned it into a privilege, because now you'll preach so long as you have permission. We have surrendered so much in the last 3 months.
No.
We surrendered so much.
No.
And most people think, well, as long as we have permission 51 weeks a year to preach, we have permission 51 weeks and 6 days to preach. But you turned it into a privilege that can be revoked at any time. That's a monumental loss. So if it's like, well, you know, there's a curfew at 9. I don't want to be out that late anyway. It's not a big deal. You just took the right to travel, which is in the 14th Amendment. You just took the right to travel and turned it into a permission, into a privilege that you need a permission slip for. It may not seem like you've surrendered much. You just became a slave. You can't go somewhere you're not supposed to go. You just became a slave that can only go where you're told you can go, when you're told you can go there. You surrendered your freedom.
So let's go back to the Border Patrol. Jordan, you and I...
And I apologize for saying the word balls.
And you're not even reading the comments. And then
I said it twice. I apologize. I should have said something in Greek that meant the same thing.
So you and I, two different scenarios. We get pulled over by the Border Patrol, and we're not at the border, okay?
Yeah.
We're in Watertown, New York, or somewhere in Texas. We get pulled over, and they want to know who I am, where I'm going, what I'm doing, and can I look in your trunk? And I got no problem with that. I'm like, I know that they're overstepping. I know that they have no right to do that, but you know what? I've got nothing to hide, and I'm this guy's not out to get me. And hey, here's my ID. Here's who I am. Here's where I'm going. Sure, you want to look at my... I have been pulled over and asked, "Can I see your trunk?" And I've opened the trunk of my car. And I know they have no right to do that. But you know what? I have always had good interactions with authorities by being open and transparent and telling them whatever they want to know, which for those of you who've watched Bible Thumping Wingnut and listened to Bible Thumping Wingnut for 4 years, you know, episode 34 of Bible Thumping Wingnut, when I shared a testimony of being pulled over, it caused an uproar for 3 or 4 episodes that really ended up to a breakup of the original podcast hosts on Bible Thumping Wingnut. And then shortly after that, there was a whole bunch of more stuff with theonomy and Reconstructionism, which is one of the reasons why when you talk some of these ways, Jordan, you sound like a Reconstructionist. You sound like a theonomist, and it really makes me go, bleh, don't like it.
That post mill.
Well, so let's say if well, I'll give you a real example. So in my town a few years ago, a high school teacher went missing, and it turned out that some folks grabbed her when she was jogging and raped and killed her. I don't know if it was in that order or not. Buried her somewhere, and the whole town was out looking for her, and I was out looking for her. And so they went, you know, person by like shoulder to shoulder through town. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of people looking for this woman. And when they went, like, they were opening outhouses and chicken coops and garage buildings. Ordinarily, I would not be okay with law enforcement just looking in my garage. I just wouldn't be okay with it. But this is a humanitarian issue where a woman's missing. Go in my garage. I don't care that much. Check in my outbuildings, my tool shed. It's not a big deal. And if I'm pulled over and I think that there is a reason that it's important for them to look in my trunk, like they've been told there's a dirty bomb, okay, and they're looking for a dirty bomb, and I know that if I resist, it's going to take manpower away from the search, and they're going to have to call a dog and all that stuff. Okay, all right. But if I think they're fishing, if you're just fishing for something, no, I'm not giving you. No, I'm not. So my position isn't you always have to resist, you know, the authority. Somebody might ask politely. If they ask politely, I might do it. But if it's, I want to search your vehicle, no. Why? Are you just because you're killing time? You got nothing else to do? Get out of here. You don't have the authority to do that, and they don't have the authority to do that because of what the law says. And by the way, I said at the time, back when this happened, when was that? 2010 or something? Anderson got tased by the, what? When was it?
Oh, I don't know when I just said tased. Yeah.
I said back when, he was right. They were wrong.
Yeah, you did.
And that's why they paid up. He won. They lost. He was right. It wasn't within 100 miles of the border crossing. They shouldn't have pulled him over. He had the right to resist them and tell them no.
I think he's just being a jerk. It's like the theonomists and the Reconstructionists who are like, you know, the police, you know, they'll say, if the police ever ask you a question, just say, I don't answer questions.
Okay. How about this? Let me ask you. If a guy you didn't know walked up to you and asked to search your vehicle, would you let them? No uniform, no badge, not a cop at all.
No.
He has as much legal right to search your vehicle as the cop does.
I know he does, but he can't arrest me. He can't tase me. He can't beat me.
Seems to
beat
me that you're being a respecter of persons. He doesn't have any more legal right than the cop does. Why are you letting the cop search your vehicle?
Because the cop is corrupt. He's a corrupt governing authority over me. Who I'm convinced I'm called to submit to, even though they're corrupt.
Okay, first of all, you seem really cool with tyranny. You're like, I'm submitting to them because they're tyrannical. That's basically what you just said. I'm submitting to them because they're a criminal cabal with the name government attached. All right?
Or regardless of whether or not they're tyrannical, I don't include the idea of them being tyrannical in
I'm
my...
going off what Tim just said. Tim said that. I mean, he didn't say the tyrannical part. He said criminal or whatever, corrupt. I think Tim said, I'm going to submit to them because they're a corrupt government official.
No,
so you seem really cool. You seem really cool with tyranny, but here's my concern. You seem to act as though tyranny is morally neutral. I don't have to oppose it. Why are you treating tyranny like it's morally neutral? Why aren't you treating it like it's immoral? Because it's immoral. So why aren't you opposing immorality?
Is it possible to oppose it verbally, speaking truth, telling people it's wrong, while still in action out of a self-sacrificial love, being willing to give up that aspect of my freedom?
No, it's never love. It's never love to, don't bring that love in here. I'm not going to let you do that. It's not loving. It's not loving to submit to immorality. It's not a good Christian witness to submit to immorality.
I have a question.
We have to clarify what you mean by immorality there, but I think that biblically there is definitely a case for that. Of being able to say,
it's theft.
Huh?
It's theft. The 8th commandment forbids theft. And if they take my liberty, it's theft. It's stealing from me.
Okay. Why? Okay, Jordan, you're a pastor, right?
Wait, can I say one more thing?
Go ahead, John.
So
hold on a second. Are you saying that like you're not clear why tyranny is immoral?
No. I absolutely agree that it's immoral, but let's use your description. You say it's theft.
Sure.
Is it acceptable for me to speak verbally saying what you're doing is wrong, what you're doing is theft, yet at the same time when they steal my cloak, to give them my shirt also?
My position does not imply the necessity of physical resistance. But you're citing a law that existed in the 1st century in terms of a soldier could conscript the labor of a peasant, not a citizen, a peasant to carry his pack a mile if the army was on march. And it's saying, go above and beyond. You have an obligation, but go further. There's no obligation for me to submit to tyranny, and I'm not a peasant.
But that passage isn't just about where we have an obligation. It talks about theft. If someone steals something from you, go above and beyond. If someone takes from you your cloak.
If where you're going with that is,
this is what I'll explicitly tell you where I'm going. I think we're taught.
Sounds like you're cool. You're cool with theft, and I'm not cool with you even being. I don't want you to come to America. I don't want you to come here. I don't want you to visit because I don't want someone who would let the government steal from you to come here, because then they're going to be stealing from me. Because a citizen says, I'm fine losing this. I can give this up. I don't have to prosecute you for hurting me. But if they're going around doing it to others, then me not stopping them is enabling them. As a citizen, I take care of my community. I'm not going to let them take it over.
Jordan, is it your position that the government is not currently stealing from you? Because they are.
Well, now
with
I think
taxation,
no,
with overtaxation, with improper use of your tax dollars.
there's an argument that could be made that overtaxation is theft, but I think you're pigeonholing me in the theonomy category for some reason. I understand there are some similarities in terms of our view of government, and I do think the government should be enforcing God's law. But that's not the civil code.
But you're
that's what makes
speaking.
theonomist theonomist.
You're
But hold on a second. I've said for years, and it's perfectly consistent with everything I've ever said. I've said explicitly for years, taxation is not theft. Jesus said, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's."
But excessive
And
taxation.
What's that?
But excessive taxation is, right?
I think that if it's conscripting taxation for things that are not within the realm of the authority of the government,
which I think that you would agree is happening.
Right.
You agree?
I wouldn't discipline someone for not paying their taxes if they were a conscientious objector to abortion. I wouldn't discipline them for that. But it's kind of like back to the speed limit thing. Here's the thing: if you speed, you should probably just pay your ticket. If you want to live a happy life and not be eventually, because the government will kill you eventually for speeding. By that I mean, if you don't pay your ticket, you're going to go to prison. They're going to take all of your freedom because they're acting outside of their authority. So,
but aren't you giving up your freedom?
What's that?
You're giving up your freedom by paying the ticket.
No, so you're trying to put me in a position that I don't have. I said earlier, my position does not imply that there must be a physical resistance. I may need to be a conscientious objector or a complainer. Hold on a second. Why is Pizza Hut in my parking lot? I may need to be a complainer and file official complaints regarding police action because I don't want to get shot. I mean, if you hear what I'm saying is I'm ever going to pull a gun on a cop or resist arrest, that's probably not real likely. Probably not going to happen. Sorry, I just got distracted by there's a guy in my parking lot. What was I saying? And it was Pizza Hut.
We ordered you a pizza.
Oh, that was very thoughtful.
No, I get what you're saying, but
but if you don't pay your taxes, that's what I was gonna say. If you don't pay your taxes, if you want to be Kent Hovind, well, you'll probably have to go to jail for it. So know that going into it. Count the costs, but it doesn't mean he's morally wrong. And we got to go back to the pragmatic thing or morally thing. Pragmatic, should you have to pay those taxes, or should you pay those taxes? Yeah. Morally, not all of them. It is theft. We should resist that at every given opportunity.
I want to point out. I want to respond to a comment. Dave in the comments said, "Come on, Tim, don't justify immoral behavior by somebody else's immoral behavior." I wasn't. I was pointing out, attempting to point out Jordan's inconsistency where he's calling out Jonathan for advocating for theft when we live under a system where I thought, Jordan, your position was that the government is stealing from us, taking too much away from us.
I'm going to do everything I can to stop it while recognizing that they can kill me. It doesn't mean that I think everything is worth dying over.
That's my point. That's my point when you get pulled over by the Border Patrol. It's not worth it.
Because yours is not a position of, if you're arguing about what is pragmatic, then I would probably agree. Was it pragmatic for Stephen to get tased by the border guards? You should have gone a different route. I'm not applauding that, but I'm saying, was he morally obligated to be stopped and searched and questioned by a law enforcement agency that was not enforcing the law, but making it up as they go along? No, he was not morally required to.
Was he?
There's lots of injustices in this. We don't have angels to govern us, so we must have men govern us. But that's the reason for limiting the power of government. That's the reason for a system of checks and balances, because we recognize depravity. And what I want people to understand more is that our nation is built upon the social compact theory of government, founded or formulated, I should say, articulated by John Locke, a Reformed theologian who wrote The Reasonableness of Christianity.
And in terms of jurisdictions, you understand the concept of the separation of powers between the three branches of government is premised upon the separation of power in the government of Old Testament Israel: prophet, priest, king. That's why we have three branches of government. Because even in the Old Testament, even in civil Israel, they had a separation of powers that would separate ecclesiastical authority among the priests and the civil authority among the magistrate, the king. That's my frustration when I hear people, advocate for the government telling the church to close down. I'm saying there's always been, in terms of Romans 13, there's always been a separation between ecclesiastical authority and civil authority, and that's a jurisdictional issue. But if I could say one thing, John, and just push back, it's not really a disagreement with what you said, but in terms of if we want to change, the culture or whatever, like the political landscape, we should be making disciples. I agree, right? But because we believe in total depravity and the concept of reprobation, some people will not be converted, and they must be controlled or defeated. Like the wicked must be restrained. That's why Romans 13 exists. It's presuming not everybody's going to be converted, and government exists to restrain that wickedness. And so even if everyone was saved who God will save, and they were all now converted, we would still have wickedness, and we would still have probably wicked leaders. There should still be a balance to power, jurisdictional authority, and we should still be doing what we can do on a governmental level to ensure the blessings of God upon our nation, which I just don't want anyone to hear what you said, which was right, and take that to mean that means we don't need to be involved actively in politics or in government, because everything will be fine when the world is converted. But I don't know what your theology is, but in mine, not everyone is going to be converted, and there will be evil remain in this world up until the eschaton and the end of the eschaton at that.
Yeah, and thank you for answering that way. I believe it's our responsibility to get involved. It's always let's pray for this guy because we like this party, and I feel we should be praying for God to raise up godly people. But like you said, not everyone is going to be. We all believe in the predestined and all that, and the laws are there to hold the wicked accountable. So thank you for answering it that way. I appreciate that.
Tim asked me yesterday, like, who holds my position in terms of Romans 13, like theologically? And I was a little bit hard pressed by Tim's question to think of notable men who you would know and recognize if I said their name. Of course, I could just say 7% of the churches that didn't close down, at least 7% agreed with me.
No,
but you have so many pastors. You have so many pastors on the other side. Historically, those who would agree with, say, Tim's view on Romans 13 would be the Quakers and the Anabaptists, and those who came from the Anabaptists, like the Hutterites, Mennonites, the Amish. They're always the same ones who are pacifists. So the Romans 13 position that Tim has or MacArthur has historically has always been tied to the pacifism that we see among the Quakers and the Amish and the Mennonites and the Hutterites and also the Christadelphians.
The Mennonites and the Amish, and I've been around them a lot. I lived in Lancaster County for a while in Pennsylvania. They don't submit to their government. They don't recognize the government. They don't pay taxes. They argue against paying taxes. The Amish are pretty much in Pennsylvania, the way it used to be. They didn't submit to the government. The government didn't really pressure them.
I wouldn't say they would. I wouldn't say that they didn't submit to the government. I understand what you're saying. They do have special rules, just like when it comes to conscientious objecting, like of war. They have special rules that apply to them. But they certainly would not resist the government because they're pacifists. They operate under religious exemptions, but they're not resistant to government authority. But all those groups would say it's not my job to vote. And the reason they say it's not their job to vote is because we're just to submit to whatever the government tells us.
Jordan, I think that you have your hand over your microphone on your phone.
Oh, my bad.
And so the other question I had, who holds, when I was asking you who holds your position historically, is who holds that position that Paul and Peter, when they're talking about submit to authorities, who historically holds to, well, in the United States, that doesn't mean people with flesh and blood. That means the written documents that our founding fathers agreed on.
I would say almost everyone up until recently, when we had our modern day downgrade. I mean, you've heard of the Black Robe Regiment, right? These were Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, Wesleyans, Congregationalists, all who said, yeah, we're to submit to our rightful authority, but our rightful authority is not King George. Our rightful authority is the colonial government, not the British government. It's not as simple as just saying, well, just the government, whoever tells me. They had to think in their context. Now, this was pre-Constitution, but in their context, what legal authority do they have? And that's been the position of Christians, I mean, for hundreds of years. It's not novel. It's not unique. It's almost held by almost any Christian who understands we don't have an actual emperor and has to think out, well, then what are we submitting to?
Well, I've been listening to you and to a whole bunch of people for a long time about this, and only till recently had I heard anybody refer to it that way.
We live in a day and time where 93% of churches decided to close down because the government told them to. So there's a lot of dummies out there today. I mean, it doesn't surprise me that you might not have come across someone with a biblical position. Considering
no, I haven't heard you make the argument, or anybody. Yeah, and even till today, the only three people I've heard make that argument,
unfortunately,
is you, Jeff Durbin, and Len Pettis.
Well, don't put me in the same category as Jeff Durbin, and see, here's the thing. There are names I could give you I don't really want to give you, but you would recognize them. It's because I don't agree with them on other issues. But David Barton is a big one. Wall builders. I think he owns the domain for Black Robe Regiment. I think he actually owns that domain. Wall builders does. Chuck Baldwin, my friend here in Montana.
American Vision. Gary DeMar.
Can't help it if they have read the Constitution. Understand American law.
All right. So I'll give an opportunity at the end here for anybody to chime in, but let's wrap this up with, okay, we say this a lot on the network, and that is that biblical Christianity's marketplace of ideas. We agree on the core doctrines of Christian faith, but there's room for disagreement, and there's room for fellowship within the disagreement. And Jordan, how do you deal with people who don't agree with you? If there was somebody with my position in your church, how long would they last? Would you seek to boot them or convert them if they wouldn't convert to your line of reasoning? Is there room for somebody to disagree, even within your fellowship? Because there's somebody who was going to be here who wanted me to ask you that question. How do you interact with how do you go to a church? How do you go to a church where your leadership doesn't hold your same position? Either side of the position.
So in 12 years, I think we've disciplined a person once for a theological disagreement. And that was because they were a Judaizer. There's been a few people we wouldn't let join because of their position on something like infant baptism, but so we don't go around kicking people out because they disagree with us on this or that. Although I think there's an understanding that this is what I'm going to teach, whether you like it or not, and it won't be contradicted in an obnoxious, repeated fashion. Speak your mind and get it done with. But I would not encourage someone to go to a church that has a view of Romans 13 that would close down for coronavirus. In fact, even though I've said for years, if your church has a problem, do your best to work it out with them. And, the quote from Augustine, which he probably didn't say, but, the church is a whore, but she's my mother and I love her, all that. Stick by your church. I'd encourage you not to stick around if you have a good alternative. Your pastor's a coward and doesn't deserve to be a pastor if he closed down for coronavirus because the government told him to. We're going into an age in the eschaton in which Christians will be persecuted and our lives will be on the line and we'll be imprisoned. It's coming down, and it's going to come down real fast. There's basically a golden idol right now built called Black Lives Matter that these same evangelical people who close down their churches are bowing down in the streets to worship. We're going to be facing, my children, my grandchildren are going to be facing incredible persecution in this country. And what we've witnessed in the last 3 weeks was the means and the mode by which they'll do it. Because my generation, this generation, decided that we would exchange religious liberty, which shall not be infringed. And we've exchanged it for privileges and a permission slip. And one day they're going to take that permission slip for public safety, except it won't be a disease and it won't be a virus. It'll be, you're inciting violence. You're going to incite, a riot. They're going to take away our freedom. I don't trust my life and my children's lives and grandchildren's lives in the hands of a pastor who lacks guts to stand up to something that's about as bad as the common flu. Get out if you have an alternative. And if you don't have an alternative, most people don't have a good alternative just because of where they live. Then you need to seek that pastor. You need to say, this was a sin. We have an obligation to meet on the Lord's Day. The government does not have jurisdictional authority over the church. We believe in the separation of church and state as Baptists. That means we don't believe that the church should be executing criminals, prosecuting them. All we should be doing to criminals caught amongst us is handing them over to the government for investigation and prosecution and trial. That's not our role. That's not us. We have ecclesiastical authority, but the government has civil authority, not ecclesiastical authority. And if your pastor doesn't understand that simple concept, then Caesar is leading your church instead of the pastor. So, I'd like to say, well, here's how you get along with a leader who I would seek, if you have no choice, you got to stay there. I would seek their repentance and say, you figure out right now where you're going to stand when things get really tough. Because you bow your knee over this, you're sure going to bow your knee in the future.
We could talk about the closing of churches for quite a while, that's for sure. But we should wrap it up. It is, we've been on for an hour and 45 minutes. Jonathan Bradford, you would agree with everything that was just said by Jordan Hall, right?
I would definitely agree with a lot of what we've heard here, and a lot of what he said. I don't. I think he might disagree with this statement, but I think he and I would actually be a little closer than we might otherwise have thought at the beginning of this. I've been educated through this, but I don't think my position has changed much. But I do understand a little bit better where Jordan's coming from. But I would say, you know what? We live in a time in North America, whether it's Canada or the US, where we have been unbelievably blessed with the liberties and freedoms that we have. But Christ never promised that to us. He never promised us freedom, liberty. He never promised us ease. In fact, he guaranteed that we wouldn't have it. He actually promises us the opposite. And in the midst of it all, I think what he calls us to is following the path that he and his apostles and disciples set for us. And I think that is to constantly be speaking truth and spreading the message. But at the same time, I do think it involves, and and I know Jordan's going to cringe when I say this, I do think it involves a very, very strong flexibility, which will bend very far in a self-sacrificial love towards others. Shaking his head, not cringing yet visibly, but shaking his head. And I would go much further on that. And I would say that in doing so, I'm striving to walk in the footsteps of Christ, in that self-sacrifice of myself in love for my neighbors and in love for my enemies.
Can we be honest? Just tell us that you're sacrificing that which belongs to your children. You can sacrifice yourself all day long. I want to hear you say, out of love, you'll sacrifice your children's liberties. Tell me that.
Out of love, first of all, I'm single with no kids, but I get your point. Out of love, I would show them the path of Christ. I would show them the path of self-sacrifice. I would tell them that Christ never promised them freedom, liberty, or ease. And to not necessarily pursue those.
You better be glad. You better be glad that we Americans are down here to preserve your liberty up in Canada, because it doesn't seem like you have the willpower to do it yourself. So it's gonna have to be guys like us to preserve your liberty. We ought to charge you taxes. We should charge you rent on our continent.
I am glad to God. I'm thankful to Him that He has ordained the country that I live in, even if I may disagree with the means to which we got there. But I would teach that to my children as well. I would want to teach them the path of Christ-likeness, which I think is a path more of self-sacrificial love than, and you would say it's not love, but that's what I see in the scriptures. Like John said earlier, we are ambassadors in a foreign country. We are citizens of heaven, not of this earth. And we should bend pretty far, even while speaking out against the tyranny of a sinful, oppressive government that we live in. And I'll end it there, Tim.
I can't find any place in the scripture off the top of my head where bending is spoken in such positive, glowing light as you've portrayed it.
Fine. Philippians chapter 2, Matthew chapter 5.
Bending the knee to Baal like a reed bending in the wind. That's great. You'll bend to Baal, but only so far. You'll bend in the wind, but
I won't break. By that meaning, if I am asked to sin, I won't do it. But then you and I are going to disagree on what it means when the government's asking us to sin. But I'll bend pretty far. You know, I've had this discussion with other people. If the government in my country made a law tomorrow that said on Fridays everybody must wear a purple t-shirt, and we're going to deliver t-shirts in the mail to you, and you must wear a purple t-shirt, I'll go, okay, I'm wearing a purple t-shirt on Friday. If they say everybody must wear a purple t-shirt in support of a woman's right to choose and to be pro-abortion, and if you don't wear the purple t-shirt on Friday, you're going to be arrested and executed on Monday, I'll go, yes, I'm getting executed on Monday.
If somebody knocks on my door and says, I'm from the U.S. government and you should give me your guns right now, I'm handing them my gun.
Say that again.
Oh, I just wanted to get a reaction out of
He's just trying to get you riled up.
Say that again.
If the government says that
you're trying to finish this.
Oh yeah, I know. If the government says I have to give him my gun, I'll give him my gun.
Well, I want you to go give them your gun right now, because slaves shouldn't have guns. That's dangerous. Free men should have guns. You're a slave. You don't need guns. You don't need to vote.
And what did Paul say to slaves?
You should bend over and you should lick the boots of those who feed you.
What did Paul say that slaves? How did Paul say slaves should act?
I'm not a slave. I'm a free man. You're a slave. So you should hand in your guns. I don't want slaves to have
obey your master.
That's a recipe for disaster.
Be a good slave.
I mean, you recognize that the Constitution tells you that there's the right of a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state. The purpose of that gun is to defend your rights. And if you're not willing to use a gun to defend your rights, you just hand them over. You're not worthy of rights. You're a subject. You're a peasant. I'm a free man. So there's I'm not faulting you for being a slave, but you're a slave. I'm a free man.
If God calls me to be a slave, I'll be a good slave.
He's called you to be a slave to him, not to a wicked Caesar.
That's not what Paul said to slaves.
They were actually slaves. He doesn't tell free people to become slaves to Caesar.
I was just joking about the gun thing, though. But
it's nothing to joke about. It's nothing to joke about.
So what? Okay, what I'm okay. All right. What I'm gathering here is it's not a theological thing. It's a patriot, nationalist, constitutionalist, libertarian issue. That's really what's coming out here, because you're attacking Tim or anyone else that disagrees.
No, I'm not attacking him. I'm just clarifying he's a slave. That's not an attack.
You told him to give his gun in a tone. You told him to give his guns in now.
Guns are for free men. Guns are for free men, not slaves.
Right, and that same tone you used with Jonathan saying you ought to thank God.
I don't talk about tone. I don't respond to comments about tone. I won't have a conversation about tone.
Well, that's just arrogance.
No, that's sub-intellectual. I didn't come here to have a dumb conversation.
It's arrogance and pride.
I don't deal with conversations about tone. I won't have the discussion. It's sub-intellectual. I'm not going to argue with a fool.
That's exactly. You made my point. But
you didn't have a point. You were talking about tone.
No. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. This is how you be known as the children of God. That's all. That's written right there.
You're talking in emotion right now. You can't have a rational discussion with someone being emotional.
There's your arrogance coming out again.
So
I'm not going to have a conversation about your feelings.
Oh, I know, because you can't relate emotionally, and you don't want to take
it's a distraction. What are you doing? You're distracting from the discussion because you're talking about feelings and your subjective impression of tone.
Wait a minute.
It turns down the conversation. It doesn't assist it.
I'm tired of the talking down towards Tim and Jonathan and anybody else. That's all.
I'm tired of you talking about tone.
Wait a minute. I took over the conversation. I muted both of them. See, I understand what Ed is saying. And I understand what JD's saying, because what happened is, instead of talking about the constitutional arguments that Jordan Hall is making, we're now talking about tone, which is what his point is. And both guys got up from their cameras. Ed, did you want to talk about his constitutional focus versus the scriptural arguments?
If there's a constitutional focus, the question is, in what way do we follow Romans 13? And then we have to discuss the Constitution, because we have to know how we follow Romans 13.
All right.
I just don't understand, Jay. I'm trying to get what when you come across, and please take this with the utmost respect. When you come across, and then
I'm not going to have a conversation about tone with you or with anyone else. It's not worth my time. I will not do it.
So because you're not accountable to anybody.
I do not have conversations about tone. I do not have conversations about tone.
So it
doesn't help the discussion. It is a waste of time.
Well, your feelings don't count when it comes to what the Bible says. Neither do mine.
Then let's not talk about
my opinions. Don't count when it comes to what the Bible says. Neither do yours. But you have an opinion that on tone, and we're called to love. We're not called to criticize
Yep.
The way
And we have
you're talking
apparently
down
a
and
different
condescending to
definition.
people.
You're assuming that tone corresponds to love. It does not. I'm going to
that's
speak
not a-
clearly. I'm going to speak articulately because I love you. I will not be distracted by conversations about your subjective impression of tone and how you interpret it because I love you.
Okay, I love you, but I disagree with you. I disagree with you telling someone from another country that they should be thankful that they have us.
Wow.
I think he would. I think
actually,
if
they
you
should.
asked, I think if you asked him, he'd probably tell you he's thankful for us. What's wrong with that? Canada, of course, should be thankful for us. If not, they'd be a third world country.
A lot of countries should.
They don't have.
Not in.
They don't
You
have to
shouldn't
pay
say it in a
for
condescending manner.
They don't have to pay for a significant. No. Truth is not condescending. Like, is it some kind of mystery? I mean, 90% of their country lives within a short drive of the American border for a reason. They don't have to go billions into debt for a military because they happen to be right north of us. That's not an insult. That's reality.
We live close to the border for climate reasons. It's warmer down south.
It has nothing to do with our economy thriving right here, right? It has nothing to do with that.
It really does not, because cities were settled long before you had the economy that you have now.
All right, you should be grateful for the United States of America, because if not, you'd probably be speaking Russian.
All right, I want to thank everybody for coming on tonight. Jonathan, are you raising your hand, or was that I'm looking at you on YouTube? It's behind. No, you're shaking your head now. Okay. JD, thanks for coming on. John and Ed Williams, thank you for coming on. Jonathan Bradford, thank you very much. If you enjoyed this discussion, this is kind of stuff that we do here on the BTWN channel. Usually it's not quite as spicy, but it does get spicy, and I like it. I like to have conversations. I like to disagree and agree. We talk about a whole lot of stuff here. And every other week I have on a single individual. And let me say, there were some things that we were going to have on, and people have been looking forward to them. We were going to have somebody on from the Facebook group who was going to debate about women preachers. And people were looking forward to that. Hey, when's that happening? I heard that was happening this week. Well, what happened with that was that the person who was going to be involved in that debate actually dropped out because they got frustrated with me. I asked one person to debate them, and the person said no. And then I was going to go on to somebody else, and this is more information than I need to share. But if you're the person who was wondering what happened to that debate, the person who was going to argue from the women should be pastors side, they dropped out, which was unfortunate. And then there was another thing we were going to do, but we put that off as well. But we're going to start doing these again every Sunday night. So subscribe if you have not already, and then click the bell button so that you'll get notifications. And again, if you appreciate what's been going on here and this type of discussion, go to BibleThumpingWeNet.com and check out all the things going on there. There are podcasts by two of the individuals that were on today, and actually three of us. You can go check those out, and also a whole bunch of other stuff there, blog articles and so on and so forth. So thanks everybody for watching. Give a thumbs up, subscribe, and that's it. Check out buildersummit.org. Thanks again, guys. And until next time, take care.